This is Paul Schneiderman today on the 58th edition of Sports and Stuff on RainierAvenueRadio.world. Today I have two very special guests. One is a prominent children's sports author right next to me at our Seattle studio, Thatcher Heldring. Another guest by phone today is a prominent middle school librarian in Ohio, Karen Yingling. We're going to have a discussion today all about children's sports books. Should be a fun discussion. Before I go further with this interview, I want to recognize my engineer today, Chad Anderson. Chad is a host of a new rap show at RainierAvenueRadio.world. We have a lot of good things going on in our sports department. We have shows hosted by Rick Dupree, a show hosted by Granville Emerson, Rolat Laurent. They co-host a fun show called Lidline Sports. Masvita Marari is the host of a Seattle Sports Weekly show. Pat McCarthy, Masvita, co-host a show on the Seattle Metro Sports Conference, and Mark Bryant has a fitness-based show, Fitness Corner. Juan Cotto and Mike Cobrisi have a show. My Sports and Stuff show has been around now for over 2 years and a lot of fun. Most of my interviews are on my law firm website, plslawoffices.com, and they're on Mixcloud. You can follow me on Twitter at plslawoffices.com and on Facebook. Well, Thatcher Heldring, the gentleman next to me, is based in Seattle. He's married with 2 kids. He attended the University of Washington. He now works at the UW in the marketing as a marketing communications manager at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Thatcher's written 4 children's sports books that have received national acclaim from the Washington Post, Kirkus Reviews, and other pundits. Thatcher's book, Toby Wheeler, 8th Grade Benchwarmer, which I finished this week, has been endorsed by the great basketball coach Phil Jackson. My second guest today, Karen Yingling, is a cross-country coach and a middle school librarian near Columbus, Ohio. She's a specialist in middle school reading. Karen has reviewed children's books for the School Library Journal and Young Adults Book Central. She was a panel moderator in a 2017 discussion about sports books. Karen actually was interviewed on a podcast, one of Thatcher's books, The Football Girl. We're going to have a great conversation today, and I don't think we can do much better on a discussion about sports children's books with these 2 great guests. Karen and Thatcher, thank you both for coming on Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
Thanks for putting me in, Coach.
Thanks, Karen. Well, here's my first question for both of you. And when I think of American children's sports novels, I'm speaking through my own lens here a little bit. I'm thinking about growing up in the 70s and 80s. I think of the author, Matt Christopher, who died back in 1997 at age 80. His sports novels were written mainly for elementary and junior high kids. I read a bunch of his books. I want both of you to share a little bit about the influence of Matt Christopher in the subject of children's sports literature. And can Matt Christopher be properly known as the pioneer of American children's sports books? Let's start with you, Thatcher, and I want to hear what Karen has to say about Matt Christopher's influence.
Sure. Well, as a kid growing up, I definitely read Matt Christopher. I think he could be called a pioneer in sort of figuring out that you could tell great stories and tell great stories about life through sports. So I certainly appreciate that, and I think anybody writing sports fiction for kids now owes a debt to a certain extent to Matt Christopher.
Karen, give us your librarian take on Matt Christopher as a middle school librarian.
I think Christopher certainly popularized sports tales, but there were certainly a lot of others before him. There's a great book by Michelle Nolan called Ball Tales that covers sports fiction from the 1930s to the 1960s. And I think a lot of people who grew up earlier than the 70s are familiar with a lot of other ones. But certainly Christopher is a very big force in children's literature.
Why do you think he seems to get most of the attention when a lot of people analyze the history of American children's sports books? Go ahead, Thatcher.
He must have struck a nerve. I mean, I think he found the formula. He was doing something right, maybe at a time that readership was increasing, that sports viewership was increasing, and everything sort of came together. And he, whatever he did it well. And a lot of people remember that. You hold on to those things from your childhood.
Karen, a little more on Matt Christopher you want to add? I had a question for both of you. Why does he seem to get so much attention as a children's sports author?
He was very prolific, and he wrote over a very long period of time. There's an exquisite biography of him by his sons that talks about all that he went through in order to write his books, and he never gave up. And I think that he just hit the market with so many titles that you can't ignore him.
Well, I love the background you provide, Karen, and learning a little bit more about this author and some other children's sports authors. This is Paul Schneiderman, host of Sports and Stuff on RainierAvenueRadio.world with children's sports author Thatcher Heldring and a librarian, Karen Yingling, based in Ohio. Okay, here's my next question for both of you. And this is going to be, I imagine, I'm going to get a lot of feedback on this question. And I like to be a provocateur sometimes. So I want to get both your thoughts to this kind of question topic. All right, a lot of people have some strong feelings about youth sports. Little League sports have become a big industry in many ways. Some people believe that youth sports leave a lot of kids out and discouraged, that sports can be way overly emphasized in our society. They can get out of control. How do both of you react to some educators, parents, and others who may feel, hey, we don't want kids spending too much time reading sports books. It's just perpetuating the madness of sports in our society. Give me your thoughts on that, Thatcher. I want to get Karen's thoughts.
I can certainly see all sides of that, and you make a couple of great points, Paul, that number one, there's some serious equity issues in sports. For example, club soccer and any club sport that, charges a lot of annual fees, and there's some access issues related to that. Even some, I think, representation issues probably within sports literature itself is probably a problem too, and certainly the every parent trying to get their kid a scholarship issue and really overdoing it in that respect. But let's not throw out the good with the bad here. I think, to a much larger extent, there's so much positive in youth sports and so many wonderful stories to tell. I tell kids that I'm coaching that I think that sports is one of the purest expressions of the human spirit. It's just who you are out there. And you can't hide from it. You can't lie about it. It tells us everything about who you are, and that's just a way to prove what you're capable of and practice all of those life skills that are going to be with you forever. Whether it's sort of teamwork or perseverance or dealing with adversity, dealing with success. Sports is the ultimate platform for dealing with all of those things, I think.
So, Carrie, what is your reaction? What is your rebuttal or reaction to that broad question about how some people may frown on kids reading too much about sports? Give me your feedback on that.
Yeah, that seems very odd to me, actually, not really being in the sports world, being more on the book end. It seems to me that the elite sport athletes are a very rare occurrence. I'm in a middle school in a very suburban area, and we had trouble last year getting enough kids on our football team. So to say that reading about sports is somehow putting an overemphasis on it seems odd. But I'm with Thatcher that so many kids in middle school have so much identity tied in with the sports. I think it's good for them to see that. I don't think it contributes to any kind of pressure. Fair
enough. I think Thatcher had something else to add.
I think two other things too, and I certainly agree with what Karen's saying. Number one is I think as an author, one of the things I appreciate is the opportunity to bring something positive to the overall narrative about sports. Right? We can sort of control the story within the pages of our book, and tell constructive stories about sports and keep it a positive thing. The other thing I think about sports books is actually I think it's an entry point into sports, a safe entry point into sports for a lot of kids who might not feel like they're physically confident enough to play. It's still a way to participate in that world and to sort of enjoy the experience of sports.
That is excellent, yes.
As a reader, and I think that can be just as fulfilling as competing on the field.
Sometimes ask questions, like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, doesn't mean I agree with the premise of the question, but sometimes I think we can get some dialogue based on a question, and both of you gave interesting answers. Paul Schneiderman, host of Sports and Stuff on RainierAvenueRadio.world with children's sports author Thatcher Heldring, based here in Seattle, and middle school librarian Karen Yingling. Okay, so my lens, I guess, as a kid, when I was a kid in the 1970s and 80s, so that we can't help it. We all have our own lens of how we grew up and where we grew up. You definitely want to try to broaden those lenses, but sometimes our perspectives can come from where we grew up and the era we grew up in. So when I was growing up, I remember that Matt Christopher's books would be in libraries and bookstores, but there weren't, from what I recall growing up, tons and tons of children's sports books. But now you go to a bookstore, you go online, you go to a library, there's a lot more children's sports books. How do both of you explain that there's so many more children's sports books these days than there were, say, even 20, 30 years ago? Go ahead, Daniel, then we'll get to Karen. Or I'm sorry, Thatcher. Your brother's name is Daniel. My bad.
Well, I have to think that the overall popularity of sports among kids has also increased and expanded over the decades. There are more sports to watch, there are more channels to watch sports on, there are more opportunities to go to and to participate in sports. So I think that naturally filters its way to books as well. And it makes sense to me. Literature and sports just go together so well. All the components that make sports interesting also make literature great. I'm talking about, sort of logical plotting, tension, strong character, adversity. They go together so well that it would almost be odd to me if there weren't lots of books about sports on the shelf. Another trend I've noticed, and I'd be interested in Karen's perspective on this also, over the last 10 years is some real brand name, nationally known writers who have taken up writing youth sports fiction. For better, for worse, for more of a mid-list author like myself who can't sort of compete with sort of these national names. But I think that's been a factor contributing to youth sports literature as well.
Karen, anything else to add on this kind of larger volume of children's sports books than ever before?
Yes, I think that, and I am of the same era that you are, during the 60s and 70s, there were not as many books published. When I was in middle school, I was reading books that were published in the 1940s because there were not a lot of new things published. Now, all manner of topics have many more books. And although I have seen a lot more in sports in the last 20 years that I've been a librarian. So you're not hallucinating that.
Great feedback from both of you, just learning more about why there's so many more children's sports books than ever before. And Karen's point about the publishing is fascinating, because I remember being in school in the 1970s and early 80s and seeing all these books from like 50 years before. I think Thatcher had something else to add.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just the other point, I think, as I'm thinking about it, the books I grew up with, particularly I'm thinking like Judy Blume, even just the idea of a category of literature devoted to the issues of youth growing up itself was novel. And I think that sports is now sort of a natural extension of that. But I wanted to just, remember that even the idea of books about kids and what they're dealing with as young teenagers was new even, 30 years ago.
If you're just tuning in, this is Paul Schneiderman on RainierAvenueRadio.world. My show is Sports and Stuff. I have author Thatcher Heldring and middle school librarian Karen Yingling as my great guest today. So, Karen, you did a podcast. You were interviewing a podcast about Thatcher's book, The Football Girl. I haven't had a chance to read that book, but I did finish Thatcher's book this week, which I really enjoyed. Toby Wheeler, 8th grade bench warmer. And we're in a unique position here where I have a reviewer on this show with the author, Thatcher. The reviewer is Karen. And I know you've read thousands of children's books. Why don't you share us a little bit about Thatcher's book, The Football Girl, and what you appreciated so much about it?
For one thing, anytime I can get a book that appeals equally to boys and girls, it's a wonderful thing. And I was looking up some of the reviews of Thatcher's book on Goodreads, and I thought it was very unusual that there were a lot of librarians and teachers who read his book and reviewed it. If you go on Goodreads and you look up things by Tim Green or Mike Lupica, you'll see my review and the review of 400 12-year-old boys. So I like that it appeals to a wide audience. And it was a good story, and it involved a girl who runs cross country, which was what really drew me to it.
And you're a cross-country coach, too, aren't you, Karen?
Yes.
Gotcha. Why don't you share with us, Thatcher, a little bit about the football girl, and why don't you also share with us a little bit how the sports culture in Seattle, if any, in any way, played a role in your decision to write sports books?
Let's see. Let me take those one at a time.
Fair enough.
Well, The Football Girl, that was the most recent book I wrote. And like a lot of stories, it started as something completely different. The main character, Tessa, I had in mind as a more minor role. In fact, what I really wanted to write about was a boy who, for certain circumstances, ended up on the girls' soccer team, and what that would have been like to be competing against girls as the only boy on the team. Sometimes the story leads you, as the writer. And what happened was I ended up with this character, Tessa, who, wanted to play football. The interesting thing that I went through as I was sort of plotting this out was that actually a girl playing football right now is not exactly revolutionary. Right? It does happen.
Not at all, no.
Mostly in the kicker position. So as a wide receiver, it's a little more unusual, but it's still not front page news anymore. And so it was kind of fun for me to sort of balance that maybe the point of the story is it's not that big a deal. And then what do you do with that, right? And then I really enjoyed being able to tell the story from a couple different perspectives. Her, I guess her significant other, Caleb, is the other main character, and sort of enjoyed thinking about what that would be like as as sort of a promising football player with family expectations, suddenly being on the team with your first girlfriend.
Yeah, I look forward to reading your book. Paul Schneiderman, again, host of Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio. I look forward to reading your great book, The Football Girl. And let me ask you something, Thatcher, about your book, which I finished yesterday. Toby Wheeler, 8th grade bench warmer. I mean, my gosh, a book about an 8th grade kid on the bench on a sports team. Believe me, did I relate to that. So I think a lot of kids can relate to that. And Thatcher, when you wrote that book, was part of your reasoning in writing that book, it must have been beyond sports. It must have been addressing some age-related challenges that junior high kids go through. Was that part of your purpose of writing the book?
The Toby Wheeler 8th grade bench warmer honestly was based on my life as a 12th grade bench warmer. Almost everything that happened to Toby in that book, everything he thought, everything he saw, everything he felt, connected pretty directly to experiences I had as a senior walk-on on my high school basketball team. And I really enjoyed that experience. It was a positive one for me. I felt like a fan who had really good seats and got to ride on the team bus. And so in a lot of ways, it was actually kind of exhilarating, and once in a while I got a little bit of playing time. But I think the point to me was that this was a perspective in youth sports and in literature that I felt like I wanted to bring. We would talk about it maybe as point of view if you were teaching a language arts class. And this was just about what does the game look like, what does the world look like from the end of the bench. Not the star player, not the parent, not the coach, but from the end of the bench. And then it was a way to bring up some, I think, some life lessons that apply to life and to sports. The idea that it takes all 12 guys to win one game, or whatever role it is you've been cast in, play it and play it well and be excellent. I
really enjoyed it, and the book was endorsed by the great coach Phil Jackson, as I mentioned in the introduction of this interview. So I recommend the book to the listeners, and I recommend that people take a look at Thatcher Heldring's books and also take a look at some of Karen Yingling's interviews and work. So I'm going to back up here for a minute. I want to talk a little bit more about some other subjects, but this is a question I'm going to ask Karen first, and I want Thatcher to opine on it as well. Karen, you work at a school as a librarian. Do you think there's more academic acceptance among librarians and other academics of youth sports books these days than there was, say, even 20, 30, 40 years ago?
I don't think that there's ever been an unacceptance. I think that a lot of times teachers and librarians don't necessarily read the books because they are not themselves big fans. I think librarians today are much more in tune with getting books that children want to read. So I think that we're seeing more in the market, we're seeing more on the shelves, and certainly I think it is helping our children read more books.
What do you think, Thatcher? Is there more academic acceptance you find of children's sports books than, say, a couple earlier generations?
I sense I tend to agree with what Karen's saying, that if you can get a quality book and a quality story into the hands of a reluctant reader or any reader, that's a victory, right? And I think as long as the story is well told, that's what really matters. I do sense, I can't back it up real well, I do sense a little bit that if there is a barrier, it's that maybe not all sort of librarians are sort of hardcore sports fans, and so that's sort of something to evolve. But I agree. I think it's the goal is to get good books into the hands of readers.
Good feedback. Paul Schneider again on Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio.world with Karen Yingling, middle school librarian, and Thatcher Heldring, sports author. Yeah, when I asked that question, and your answers were both interesting, it just seemed when I was growing up that maybe sports among educators was a little just less emphasized in general. But, times change, and there's all sorts of reasons, as both of you have shared, with the proliferation of more children's sports books. So, Thatcher, back to you. You've written 4 children's sports books, I believe. Is that correct?
4 is correct, yeah.
Okay. And which of the 4 that you wrote would you say you enjoyed the most writing?
Wow, good question. I think, I've heard authors joke that if you have multiple books, it's kind of like your kids, and you hope nobody ever asks you which one is your favorite. And just like raising all of your kids is a unique experience, so is writing each of the books. So they've all been different. I think the first one, and I think this is true of a lot of storytellers in a lot of different formats or media, the first one is the closest to my personal story. And then the others were...
The Toby Wheeler book.
The Toby Wheeler book. And then the others were sort of explorations of maybe perspectives I hadn't necessarily had firsthand.
Real quick question, the Toby Wheeler book, and I know it was kind of semi-autobiographical. Did you date the coach's daughter?
That part was made up.
Okay. That was a fun part of the book, though. Paul Schneiderman again, if you're tuning in a little late on Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio with author Thatcher Heldring and librarian Karen Yingling. Okay, this is for Karen, and I'm going to have Daniel get on this question as well. What are a couple of your favorite nonfiction children's sports books, Karen?
There is an excellent one by Philip Hoos that's Addicts, Oscar Robinson, and the basketball team that awakened a city. Set in the 1960s, and don't ask me the city because I now forget now that you've asked me that. Andrew Moranis has a couple that are out. I do more fiction than nonfiction because, the nonfiction, if it's about concussions, it's about concussions.
Well, why don't you share with us, and I'm going to ask Thatcher the same questions, a couple sports fiction books for youth that you have enjoyed over the years, besides Thatcher Heldring's great book?
I love Carl Duker. He has, Runner, a whole bunch of other things. There's one by Michael Currender called Running Full Tilt, which, of course, involves cross-country that I like. Let's see, Rich Wallace has a lot of series for younger kids, as does David A. Kelly. Jeff Herbach does a really, really excellent young adult sports story, as does Paul Volpone. So there's so many of them, and I just like to have all the sports books so that I can hand them to kids.
So much fun to have some of these other sports authors' names mentioned. All right, Thatcher, it's your turn. Mention a couple good nonfiction children's sports books that you've enjoyed, and a couple other good children's sports books, other fictional that you've enjoyed besides your great books.
Yeah, let me go right to fiction. And Karen mentioned Rich Wallace, and I'm not sure that I would actually be an author and a sports author without Rich Wallace. I just think he he's so underappreciated. And I identify most with his young adult fiction, that by meaning that fiction that had a little bit more sort of mature content, was more more of a junior high school audience than my books. But he just has such a powerful and yet simple, subtle way of bringing together sports and life in ways that feel so lived in and so real. And I just, sort of really always, admired that, and it
Rich
really
Wallace.
resonated with Rich Wallace,
Okay.
and that really resonated with me. And I won't say I try to emulate it, because that's him and I'm me, but it really struck a chord with me.
Any nonfiction sports books that you've enjoyed over the years for kids?
I've enjoyed watching my kids learn about all sorts of historical sports figures, particularly through the Who Was books. It's just a series of, actually, I think, really well done, sort of simple autobiographies for middle elementary school kids. So everybody from Jackie Robinson to Muhammad Ali. And anybody in the middle. I think that's been a wonderful introduction to all those figures and the real role they played in actual human history.
I've seen some of those young children's books based about Jackie Robinson, some of those sports icons, and those are pretty good gift idea books, I think. Well, we're getting close to winding this down. What do we have, about 2 minutes left, Chad, or so? Couple minutes left. Okay. Well, I got about a minute left. So, Karen, I want your feedback real quickly. We only have so much time left on what you see happening in the future with children's sports books. And Daniel, Thatcher, I want you to share what's in your future with children's sports writing. Go ahead. Start, Karen. Go ahead first.
I'm seeing a lot more diverse books. So we have lots of different cultural backgrounds, levels of ability. And there's actually another book coming out in January by Sarah Hennings called Throw Like a Girl. That's another girl on a football team. So we're seeing hopefully more girls sports, and so that all kids can see themselves on the cover of a book.
Absolutely important to have more girls' sports books. Okay, what's in your future, Thatcher?
Oh, I know I've got more stories in me. I don't have anything specific to reveal right now, but I can't wait to tell them.
Well, I really enjoyed this interview. It's been fun as a sports radio host to do a show on children's sports books. Thank you so much, Karen and Thatcher, for coming on Sports and Stuff on Rainier Avenue Radio.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks.